Right, so we're going to be sketching gradient functions. So hit pause, copy the lesson objective down. Once you've done that, hit play, and we'll sketch some gradient functions. Right, so we're going to do exactly what it says on the tin basically. We're going to consider a function and then we're going to sketch its gradient function. So if we consider this function here, we're going to look at what happens along the curve to its gradient. So we need to have a gradient function that we can sketch. Now one thing we know for certain is what happens at these turning points. We've got one here, one there, and one there. We know for certain that dy by dx at these 3 points is 0. So we can sketch the corresponding points on our gradient graph. There, there, and there. So at these 3 points we know that dy by dx is equal to 0. We've got horizontal gradients here. Right, so now if we consider what's happening to this curve here, we can see that it's got a positive gradient that gets less and less positive as it goes towards 0. So it starts off quite high, so we can mark it on here, say approximately there, it's positive there, and we move towards 0, towards that point there. And then we look at what happens after the turning point here. It becomes a negative gradient, and quite negative, but it becomes less negative as it approaches the turning point. So somewhere in between, about halfway, we've got another turning point, well, we've got a turning point on our gradient graph, and it goes back towards 0. And then if we look at this section here, we can see that we've got a positive gradient, quite positive, but it slows down, gets less positive, and goes back towards 0. So it's increasing initially, then decreases. So we can show that as increasing initially, then decreasing back towards 0. And then in our final section of the graph here, what's happening is that it gets more and more steep as we move along the curve. So it gets more and more negative. It travels down there like that. So that's a sketch of the gradient of the graph. If I, there we are. So that's what it looks like with a nicely drawn curve. I'll remove my sketch to make it easier for you to draw. So if I remove my sketch, and that's your gradient function. Okay, and it corresponds then. Say it's positive but decreasing, so it's getting less steep, goes towards 0, and then we've got a negative gradient, but it gets less negative, goes towards 0, and we've got a turning point in the middle. And then here we've got our positive again, and at some point it changes because it's quite positive, becomes less positive to 0. And then this final section here, we've got a negative gradient that's getting steeper and steeper, so it's becoming more and more negative. Okay, so hit pause, sketch the graph. Once you've done that, hit play and we'll look at an example. Okay, so let's have a look at this example here. We've got the diagram showing y equals f of x. It's asymptotic at y equals -2. So the graph is tending towards that. It's not going to hit it. And we've got a turning point here. So we want to sketch the gradient function and then state the asymptote of the gradient function. Well, first we need to have a graph. So we can draw our gradient function graph. And let's pick out this point here because we know exactly what's happening. The gradient here at this turning point is 0, so we can mark that on our graph. There we go, so we marked our gradient there. Now I've got to look at this curve here. What's happening to the curve here? Okay, what kind of a gradient have we got? We've got a negative gradient. It gets less negative as it gets towards 0. So I can sketch that as negative, but getting less negative. So it's steep, it's getting less steep as we approach 0. It hits 0. And then on this section here, we've got a positive gradient that gets less positive, and it flattens out. As it's flattening out, the gradient is going towards 0, but it's never getting there. So what we've got is a positive gradient that turns and then heads towards 0 because it's getting flatter and flatter and flatter, but never quite getting there. And that's our gradient function. So what I can do, negative, getting less negative, and then positive, and then getting less positive and going towards 0. And I'm going to take my sketch off, make it easier for you to draw. There we go. So hit pause. Oop, before we do that, asymptote. So what's the asymptote on our gradient function? Well, we can see here it's tending towards 0 because our curve is getting flatter and flatter and flatter. So it's getting towards 0. So our asymptote is y is equal to 0. There we go. Let's say asymptotic as. Okay, so hit pause, make a sketch, and I've got a couple of questions for you. This is a sort of topic that requires quite a bit of practice, really, just recognizing what's happening. Have we got positive or, sorry, we've got negative or positive gradients, and then what's happening to them as they move along. So with practice, be able to sketch those. So it's exercise 12J, just the 2 questions, 1 and 2, although there are parts of question 1. So I'm going to attach the assignment to your work. Good luck.